Hello and welcome to this Amuse Bouche for Year 10 and Inspector Calls. So this game is really good at enabling our students to think about some of the topical issues of their own social context, and referring back to the context that Precy is writing within enables them to think about things like 0-hour contracts, the kind of differences between the class system, the idea that there is a social hierarchy, and again, students are engaging with that. It also talks about things like gender and the idea of toxic masculinity, and how characters like, for instance, Gerald and Eric are presented, and those tropes that are still within society today. So, despite there being a distance between the two generations, there's a lot to think about in terms of similarities to the social context they live within. Prior to Year 10, students are studying modern fiction in Year 7 when looking at Flowers of Algernon. They've also studied it in Year 8 when they looked at Blood Brothers. And I think both of those texts help to support students in their Year 10 study of modern fiction, especially Blood Brothers, where they're beginning to engage with social class, the obstacles faced by those who live in poverty, and the struggles that Mrs. Johnson goes through. And you could use that knowledge to help support their understanding the trials and tribulations of Ava Smith and how she's treated by the upper class. And in terms of their study going on from Year 10, you can see that they have 3 lessons for literature, and they're now moving on to 2 lessons for language. And there will be, because they're completing their KIP on question 5, there will be some lessons that are dedicated to that KIP, but in the main they're looking at unseen non-fiction, and actually some of the themes that are being referred to within unseen non-fiction help support their understanding of the social context of modern fiction. Other than the long list that we would expect to see in the technical knowledge for Key Stage 3 in comparison to GCSE, the main difference between the two is really within the key concepts. So all the way through Key Stage 3, students are working on discussing the text as the writer's creation. It's a conscious construction, there was an intent behind it. And then at GCSE, there's now a movement to talking about the social critique, and I think we talked about that previously in Year 9, where they're thinking about poets like Shelley, for instance, and the way that they're using the pen as a way of communicating their distrust of institutions, for instance, like the government or the church. Here, for this particular one, some of the themes are quite complex and quite difficult to engage with, but the scheme sort of graduates to a point where students feel quite confident with their discussion of it, because of the vocabulary and because of the way that the events are explained to them and their analysis of the writers and methods. So one thing to pick up on is I think it's about the 5th bullet point on key concepts of GCSE, is the gap between personal actions and social behaviour, and their understanding of morality, which will help to inform work later on in Year 10 on Macbeth, for instance, equally thinking about A Christmas Carol, but that in itself is quite difficult to grapple with. So here students are thinking about how perhaps for some of the Burling family, their actions seem inconsequential to them, but actually they don't understand the ripple effect of them, that people like Ava Smith almost pay the kind of consequence for them. Equally, socialism and capitalism, two key concepts for those students that they get integrate with really quickly. And the dysfunctional nature of modern society is another really big one. So thinking about how societies become fragmented and fractured, that the divisions of society actually weaken it rather than strengthen it. Within the scheme overview, we have the theme vocabulary, so you can see that the key concepts here are on one side and then the vocabulary that are attached. That doesn't mean to say that we need to address every single word, but these words will typically be used during lessons, and you'll find them on the curriculum learning slides. Key things to note really is the amount of words and language that are being used and attributed to power and control and authority, obviously. Conflict's got a lot in there, but equally relationships, and we often neglect that to think about the relationships between characters, whether they're dysfunctional are quite toxic in traits, or actually if they feel quite distant and disconnected. That opening scene where we talk about where the characters have been placed in terms of their seating on the table, there's a lot about the relationships within that family. And appearance versus reality. So the idea that actually there is consequence to that choice, there's a repercussion to it. a really brief explanation of the scheme overview. So, conceptual question for week one, for instance, is how can speech reflect relationships between people? And then everything is driven through that particular concept. The key contents are identified underneath. Then on the other side of that, you've got the question, the coverage. So it just tells you roughly which parts of the text that you're going to be referring to, and that'll be supported by the booklet. And then you've got your technical and analytical knowledge, contextual knowledge, and tier 2 vocabulary. In terms of the notes and additional resources, the version of the script will be in the booklet, and we'll talk about that in a second. There's also opportunity as well, because we have the recipe books that have been kind of donated generously from year 11 from last year and so forth. You've got those to refer to, and equally you've got the YouTube English channel, not English channel, sorry, that will help support students, that give them snippets to help consolidate their learning as well. So there's a lot of resourcing around the Inspector Calls scheme that can be used, and I think that notes of digital resources is a nice reminder of what you can use within your lesson. So the booklet is pretty straightforward in terms of design. At the very beginning of it, you'll be given each of the characters, the corresponding emoji to each of those characters. I feel like Sheila has very startled eyes. And there's a bit of a description about that character and their position in the family, what they do, key events that they're linked to. And then in the main of the booklet, you've also got the script. And there'll be key quotations that are highlighted in red. And those key quotations are either key in terms of their understanding of them that they're going to be referred to later on in the lesson, but equally it could be that it links back to the recipe books and the route map for that character, that it's a key quotation that they need to know for that character in terms of the development of their discussion of it. Just by the side of the script, there'll be an opportunity for students to create notes. There's a little section there to make notes about each of the key points within that extract, but equally students have got enough space around the script to be able to annotate in the booklet. So the literature planning grids were launched last year after the 2023 exam reports and results. And the main idea and premise of those, we were finding that students were becoming more successful if they were able to track the journey of the character or track the journey of the concept. So the way that it's constructed is it addresses all aspects of the question first, and then you begin to think about the development of that character. So for instance, the question focuses on one side, and students might write kind of horizontally what the focus is. So if it's thinking about Inspector Calls, for instance, it could be that you're focusing on sort of selfishness or social class, for instance. And that means that the student at every point in their response needs to go back to that focus of the question. That's the same for their planning, really. The first box is almost the kind of hinge, the umbrella. So what is it that the writer's trying to teach us through this particular focus? So they're thinking about social class. What is it that Preeti's trying to teach us through social class? About society and how it's divided, for instance. And then students would then develop a semantic field in the same way that they would unpick the meaning of the focus of the question, and they write down the keywords that relate to that particular focus. Characters that are linked to it. So not all characters would be applicable, so they identify which characters are linked to it, and they begin to think about the symbols and motifs that they've looked at in lessons. So it could be that they look at the bleach, for instance, the Titanic, or the beehive. And then the second section really is that tracking of the character. So thinking about 2 moments in the beginning, 2 moments, not necessarily in the middle, but at the rise in action of the play, and 2 moments at the end as well. And it's just a way of students thinking about how the idea develops, and it kind of prevents students from writing these standalone peels that are almost like islands and they don't really connect to one another. So it's difficult for the examiner to say there's a clear argument because the points that they're making seem unrelated to one another. So if they're thinking about the journey of that character, they can then use those different pivotal moments in the play to help support their discussion about how the characters become empowered or disempowered, they become weakened, and the reasons around that. The last section is not really applicable to Inspector Calls, but if you're dealing with an extract, for instance, like for instance, A Christmas Carol or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for instance, or even Macbeth, then you would think about where in the text you would talk about. So if you look at the extract itself, which key quotations from the extract would you include within your argument, and then at what point in your sort of development of that argument are you going to use it? So if the extract comes, I don't know, at the beginning of the text, it would be sensible to use references at the beginning from the extract, and then talk about how the character kind of declines or empowers itself throughout the text. So the booklets will contain the copy of the script, but the task boxes will remain on the PowerPoint, they won't be included in the booklet. So that means that you have opportunity to manipulate the instructions, perhaps the language, or even really focus on trying to get that challenge and extend with some of your students, or maybe target key areas that you felt in the prior lesson they really need to address in this lesson. So you've got more flexibility here there as well. Key questions are there to prompt their analysis and to help build that sort of resilience and stamina. Things like, for instance, what's noticeable about Burling's pronouns, so really targeting AO2 there. What can we infer from Gerald agreeing with Mr. Burling? And again, trying to support students in developing their analysis and kind of get them into kind of patterns and routines in what to look for when they're approaching a piece of text. So this is the serving suggestion that's taken from the recipe book. And just a quick point that seems to mirror the earlier literature planning grade, hopefully should. So if you notice, the introductions really focus upon the writer's intent, and that mirrors what they would do at the beginning of their literature planning grade. And then we've got the point, which will be informed by the semantic fields. We've got the evidence that's taken from the different points in the play. And then the explanation, really zooming in those key features, and that's why that identification of character and symbolism is really useful here. And then right at the very end, they do exactly that. They link back to the writer's intent, the bigger idea, or a piece of context that supports their answer. That's the end for this Amuse Bouche on Year 10 Inspector Calls. If you've got any questions or queries, please speak to your director and they'll be happy to help.